Okay, so what is a list interface? What does the list interface allow us to do? Let's imagine that we have 5 objects and we want to group these objects together and then work with them in some way. So this is our group of objects. This is our collection. List is a kind of collection with its own unique properties. In a list, we have control over where a new element can be inserted. What does this mean? It means that we have precise control over where each element is inserted into the list when we are first creating it. So if we want to place object 2 at the very end and object 5 in this position when we are creating the list, we can do that. We can have precise control over where each and every object is placed in the list. So a list interface gives us that control. How does it give us that control? Well, first, list interface actually puts the objects together in this fashion, which means that a list interface is an ordered collection. It maintains the order in which the objects exist. So object 1 exists in the first position, object 2 exists in the second position, object 3 exists in the third position, and so on. So this order is maintained. So remember that a list is an ordered collection. How does a list maintain this order? It has indices, so we can index through these objects. And we'll see that just in a moment. So in a list, we can access and search for elements using integer index, which means that the index value is always an integer. A list interface also allows duplicate elements. So you can have objects that are equal to each other repeated multiple times in a list. Now, we talked about index, right? Remember that for a list, the index is 0-based, which means that the index starts at 0 and then goes upwards. And using this 0-based index, a list is able to maintain the order of elements. Using this index, we can also access and search for elements. One other thing that the list interface allows us to do is call a list iterator. We did encounter iterator before, but there is a difference between the iterator that we saw before and a list iterator. You see, for an iterator, we had different methods. 2 of those methods were next and hasNext. What does this really give us? So let's say we have this collection here and we call an iterator on this collection. And let's say that in the beginning, the iterator is here. Now, when we call next, we can go to the next object. When we call hasNext, we understand whether or not there is a next element that exists. Now let's say we are here. Now, if we call next, we can go to this element. And if we call hasNext, we can get a return of true because a next element exists, right? So we can go in the forward direction. But what if we want to go back to this element? An iterator does not provide us with that ability. A list iterator, on the other hand, has a different method called previous and hasPrevious, which does the same thing but in the opposite direction. So a list iterator is bidirectional. So the list interface allows us to call a list iterator over the collection that we're working with. And that iterator is able to go forwards and backwards. But at the same time, we can also access the different elements using the index. So there are different ways in which we can access the elements and iterate through them for a list. Now let's get to the methods that the list interface provides us. There are many methods that the list interface has. Also remember that the list interface implements its own code for the methods that it inherits from collection and the iterable interface, because the list interface extends collection and collection extends iterable. So list interface inherits all the methods of collection and iterable. So the list interface provides its own code for implementing those methods that it inherits from iterable and collection. So we're not going to talk about all the different methods that the list interface provides us. We've already talked about the different methods that it can inherit from the collection interface and the iterable interface. And we have discussed what those methods do in the iterable video and the collection video. Here, we'll talk about some of the methods that list interface provides us with. In addition to what we saw in the collection and the iterable interface, in addition to all those methods, the list interface gives us some more methods. The first important one is the get method. So when we use the get method, we have a parameter input, and that is the index. So if we specify the index here, then this method returns the element at that index. So if we say get 2, then object 3 will be returned. And that's how the get method works. The next method we're going to look at is index of. So if you specify an object as a parameter of the index of method, it would return the index of that object in the list. But remember that a list can have multiple occurrences of the same object because a list allows duplicate elements, right? So if we ask about an object and use the index of method, the index of the first occurrence of that object would be returned. So if we use index of object 3, then 2 would be returned because object 3 is in a position where the index is 2. If there was another object 3 here at index 5, still a 2 would be returned because index of returns the first occurrence of the object. The list interface also gives us this method to use. The sublist method has 2 inputs, the from index and the to index. The sublist returns a part of the list. So if we type in sublist 2 4, which means the from index is 2 and the to index is 4, which means we're talking about these objects, right? From this index to this index. What the sublist method does is it returns these elements, but it includes the from index, which means object 3 would be included because we're starting at index 2, but we're ending at index 4, and index 4 is our to index. To index is excluded, which means that if we type sublist 2 4, then object 3 would be returned and object 4 would be returned as a list. But object 5 will not be returned because the index 4 is excluded. So the from index is inclusive and the to index is exclusive. And the sublist method returns a list that contains the objects starting from the from index and ending at to index minus 1. And again, if we have sublist 2 4, then a list would be returned where the object at 2 and the object at 3 is included, but the object at 4 is not included. And of course, as we discussed before, we have a list iterator method that returns a list iterator over the list collection. So I hope you're beginning to understand how a structure is forming. In the beginning, we had the iterable interface, and that gave us the ability to use an enhanced for loop over our collection. So the iterable interface gave us that ability. Then we had the collection interface that gave us the ability to see whether a collection contains something, whether the whole collection is equal to something, whether the collection is empty, and what's the size of the collection. And now we have the list interface that inherits from both of these interfaces. And the list interface adds some new abilities. We can get an element from a list. We can see the index of an object. We can slice out a sublist from the list. And it also allows us to use a list iterator. So this is how a structure is forming. But of course, we still don't have a concrete class. These are all interfaces. So let's now look at ArrayList, which is going to be our first concrete class. ArrayList implements list, which means that ArrayList will have all these abilities. Of course, ArrayList will have to implement some code for these abilities, but ArrayList also adds its own methods. And then ArrayList will become our first real collection that we can use in our programs.